Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to this asynchronous session. I'll just talk a little bit about qualitative research designs. This was one of the more interesting chapters that I wrote in the book because as you can probably guess, I'm more of a quantitative than a qualitative researcher. However, I do appreciate qualitative research. I also, having come out of counseling and you all being students of counseling, we do much qualitative work when we're working with clients. So much of what is discussed in this chapter, what I discussed in this chapter relates to kind of work you do in counseling, interviewing and probing individuals, asking for clarifications and building theories. Because basically you build a theory about your participant. And over the course of time, you build these theories based on the accumulation of evidence from multiple participants. So but ideally, as I've discussed before, we try to establish causation. To establish causation, we need these randomized controlled trials, these experimental designs where we have everything working perfectly, right? So that we can determine causation. However, unfortunately, that's not always possible to do. And sometimes we lack depth in the type of data we get when we do quantitative studies. We focus perhaps on one variable and try to control for all other competing causes. Instead, when we do qualitative studies, we can get in depth about something and really understand it in a very, very deep way. Like if I wanted to understand exactly why people smoke, I can say vape, why they vape. I can get all kinds of biologic data. I can do surveys, but actually sitting and interviewing people and getting their reasons, they might hint at factors that I didn't think of previously. So there's a lot of benefit to doing qualitative work. So quantitative studies, while they are good, they are not always ideal, especially when we're dealing with new ideas. With new ideas, having interviews and making observations seems to be better options. So there's several different types of designs. There's phenomenological designs. When I think of phenomenological designs, I think of counseling or just psychotherapy in general, because that's what we do. We try to understand a person's worldview or their phenomenological field. And the only way we can get to that is by interviewing them. And of course, in counseling, you try to empathize, use something like, if you still call it basic accurate empathy, to try to get into the person's phenomenological field. So that's something that you should be really good at doing. Now you can do these unstructured interviews and just that's pretty much what you do in counseling is an unstructured interview. You can do a very structured interview where we don't allow the participant to elaborate on anything, but that doesn't seem useful when it comes to qualitative study design. So semi-structured interviews are better. So you can ask questions and then you can follow up. So you generally don't want to ask closed-ended questions, like questions that have a specific answer, a yes or no answer. You want more open-ended questions, but having the ability to elaborate, to ask for elaborations from the participant is key to a semi-structured interview and to understanding one's phenomenological field. Focus groups help as well, although focus groups sometimes can be dominated by one individual rather than all individuals having a way to speak or a right to speak. Sometimes there's very powerful group members and other people feel intimidated. Focus groups may be better if we're trying to understand some more common phenomenon rather than something unique to an individual. Like to try to understand how people feel about the election. You can talk to people individually, but you can also talk to a group of individuals from a specific community to get an idea. So that's the phenomenological field. There are narrative studies. Narrative studies are interesting because we try to tell stories. It's just your average story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So when data are collected, researchers will take the information from interviews and observations, and what they'll do is weave a story that makes sense to explain what's going on. So this is again, this is how qualitative and quantitative studies differ, because in quantitative studies, you don't want to be doing that. You want the data to speak for themselves. But in qualitative studies, you do want to do that because you have to make sense of what's going on. Now, we all do this anyway for our own, using our own histories. Just through memory, we weave stories that make sense. Like if I were to ask you, like, how did you arrive at where you are today academically? You probably could tell me a really nice story that makes sense. But at the time, those events probably didn't make sense and they may have been a source of stress. However, now, when you're looking backwards in time, you can actually make it seem like everything had a meaning, everything made sense, one thing led to the other, and it was just a perfect confluence of different factors that led to where you are today. So we're really, really good at weaving stories, and we can do that too after we make observations. I mean, I certainly do that. My work with smokers, I tended to weave stories based on what I observed and what I understand. And that's really great for theory development. We do a lot of observations in qualitative studies. Observations can be complete or partial. Complete participant observation, in this case, the researcher injects herself into the culture being studied or subculture being studied and becomes essentially a member of that subculture. Like say if I wanted to know what the typical Philadelphia Eagle, I'm not, obviously I'm from, well, I think I've mentioned before that I'm from DC, so I'm not a Philadelphian. So if I were to immerse myself into Philadelphia Eagle fandom to try to understand what your prototypical Philadelphia Eagle fan is like, I would try my best to blend in as much as possible, probably wearing the same kind of clothing and doing the Eagle chant or whatever. So that would give me a insider's perspective, right? Sometimes people do that with drug culture, although obviously whenever one injects oneself into a situation fully, there's a chance that one can get swallowed up by the context and lose one's identity, lose one's objectivity, right? It means it's easy to become friends with people and fail to see the world as an outsider, and that's what you really need to be able to do. You need to be able to blend in, but also remain an outsider. And that's not always easy to do, particularly if you don't look like the people you're studying, and however you want to take that, if you don't look like them. I was just watching this one movie, I forgot what it's called now, and it's a TV series. It's from I think it's from the Navajo Indians. I'm not 100% sure, but the episode that I'm on now, there's a white reporter who's sitting in this group, asked if she could sit in this group, and he's a reporter for like the LA Times or something, and she was kind of greeted skeptically by the leader of this women's group. She's an outsider. She doesn't look like the rest of the individuals, and there's little distrust. So if one is going to become a complete participant observer, one must blend in as much as possible. And that sometimes could mean engaging in dangerous behaviors. Like if I wanted to study the culture of extreme skiers, as a skier, I'd have to engage in extreme behaviors, something that I don't do when I'm skiing. But then if I wanted to understand them, I'd really have to do that. I know in this chapter, I talk a lot about different kind of behaviors that people engage in where they become full participants. Partial participant observation, we try to keep it objective, part of the context, but remain an outsider. Sometimes we engage with the participants and participate in activities occasionally if necessary, or even if asked. I remember when we had this one group come to LaSalle. I think I talked about this the other day, to do some observations, and that's what they did. They did partial participant observation, ask questions for clarification whenever something was not understood. But in general, these individuals stood on the outside. I mean, we were aware of them because we knew we were being observed. It happens when, as a professor, when I used to adjunct, and I was adjunct adjuncting at Providence College in Rhode Island. And I remember it was an undergrad psych course. And I remember one of the requirements was that you'd have to be observed once per semester. And believe me, I was aware of that person being there. I remember my students asking me, why are you so different today? I was like, well, I'm being observed. So it was just weird. So you're aware of them, but if that person is there all the time, eventually they just kind of blend into the background. But you can ask them to help with things once in a while. Hey, can you help me move these tables, etc. So they sort of, there's some familiarity with them. But again, there's much more of an attempt to remain objective. When we look at observation, we can look at them as direct or indirect observation as well. Direct observation, in this case, the individual is present in the context. So both complete participant and partial participant observation are forms of direct observation. However, there's also indirect observation. One can observe by watching videos, reading interview transcripts, or case reports. And that's kind of the stuff that a researcher like myself does often when I try to understand something. I've done studies where we were working with mothers who were wondering if they were smoking or using drugs during pregnancy. So we'd look at their hospital records just to kind of understand them better. Although our aim was to do quantitative analysis, what we were doing was indirect observation. To be a good observer, though, it's really important to provide the context when writing. So if you just go straight to what happened without providing the context, it's really difficult. I see this in the media all the time where people purposefully delete the context to make it seem like somebody made an inflammatory comment. But when it's put in the context, maybe it's not so bad. So that happens a lot. But as a researcher who's doing a qualitative study, the context is extremely important, extremely important. And it's really important to remain objective. I mean, that's harder to do than easy to do, but one must, if one is a researcher, one must, especially in qualitative studies, one must attempt to remain objective. Let's talk about case studies. Case studies are just a very, very detailed description of something. I noticed I put a single entity because in the textbook I talk about a case study of textbooks and the inclusion of Native American history in them. So there are all kinds of case studies. When I think of case studies, generally I think of an individual. Like I might want to know a case study of somebody who has a history of performing poorly in difficult athletic situations, what people refer to as choking. I don't like using that term, but it's used a lot. So like what happened to the Yankees maybe during the World Series, people said, oh, they choked. They were up 5-0 in the game 5 last night. And the Dodgers came back and won. So it would be interesting to do a case study of individuals who have such difficulties to try to better understand what the phenomenon is. So you could do a case study. In a case study, everything is possible. Use any kind of data collection modality, whether it's a survey, measure, an interview, it's some medical records, it's observation, everything is possible. Okay, so you just want to have as much data as possible. And you want to answer the following question, like who is being observed? Of course, right? Why is she being observed? Where is she being observed, providing context, and what lens is used to make the observations? When I talk about lens, I'm talking about theoretical perspectives. It's funny when I tell people to write papers about research papers, I always say you should have some kind of a theory and you should make explicit what your theory is, because most of us have a theory that guides. In fact, when I write papers or grants, excuse me, in particular, I'll say the theory that guided variable selection. Why? Because there is some theory that I'm using to guide variable selection in a study. It's not just happening randomly. So everything we're doing is based on some kind of a model, a theoretical model, whether it's a research model, an empirical model, a model that is grounded in a lot of research, or is it some personal theory that we have? We do use these theories to guide what we do, so including observations and case studies. And ethnography is kind of like a case study. It's a qualitative method employed to understand culture and to communicate what one learns to outsiders. So you think about ethnographies, that's when I think about qualitative studies, researchers traveling to different parts of the world and trying to understand a group of people. It doesn't have to be a specific group of people in another country. It could be a subculture too, again. So some subculture within a, like the culture of I don't know, cigarette smokers in a sense, but really ethnography has to do with different cultures. Grounded theories, these are theories that are based on our observations. So it's theory building that's inductive. Inductive reasoning means building from bottom up, from observation to theory, versus deductive reasoning, which is going from theory to observation, making observations or generating hypotheses, I should say. So qualitative research is ideal for grounded theory, but it's not the only way that it's done. In fact, most people in research prefer that theories are developed from reading the literature. So indirect observation, right? Reading the literature and try to come up to conclusions. So that they like that process, although it's not always the best process, because what is published may be dictated by what is popular in a sense, right? Not everything is going to be published, especially negative findings. So building a theory from the literature may be flawed. Building a theory from direct observation has its benefits because it's based on reality. However, you may be missing stuff too. So it's better to do a mix of different types of methods. So look, there's the mixed methods grounded theory, which is one of my favorite things I ever read. It's just, when I read about this for the first time, it was like a wow moment. So one conducts a traditional grounded theory approach. And of course, they're using interviews, observations to come up with a theoretical position. So what you're doing here is coming up with a theoretical position using different modalities and then keep on refining what you have. So independently, one would do a literature review and use the results to shape a conceptual framework, right? So of whatever's being studied. So you have two independent ways of creating theory here. And then of course you want to, oh, excuse me, combine the two. I'm a little tired. I've been working all day on just a whole bunch of trying to catch up with everything I'm doing. Next, you conduct a quantitative/qualitative study. So you conduct a study, right, to get some results. So you use the results of this phase to generate a theoretical position as well. Now you review the results of all the phases and kind of finalize your theory. So what you're trying to do is sort of trying to shape a theory based on a variety of different sources. You have the empirical stuff that comes from the reading the literature and then doing the whatever the studies that you do, but then you also have a qualitative compound based on the grounded theory. So I really like that. And it is to me, it's the best way to develop a new theory. And so I want you to think a little bit about qualitative methods. Some of you may prefer qualitative methods to the quantitative methods. However, they're starting to come together a little bit. And now that we have all this technology that allows us to quantify what was qualitative. So there's software that allows one to quantify words and try to find themes in interview data and any kind of data that one gets through qualitative research. So there's a tendency to start blending the two. So what was just once qualitative and kind of like an art and trying to understand what's going on now is becoming very, very quantitative. Next thing you know, we'll have mean standard deviations. We'll be looking at distributions and the two will converge together. But for now, it's not that way. I would think about it when you're working with clients. Build your theory based on your work and then try to write it down so you understand what your theoretical model is. It may be based on some prevailing theory, but it doesn't have to be. It's probably more likely to be a mix of theories that you read about plus your own lay theory, as we call it, personal theory. And so you come up with something that's unique. Anyway, thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of the week.